Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. We're on a holiday, but I am not taking the day off because it is Monday and I have to work this day. And it's a holiday we need to talk more about. So, of course, we've got a brand new episode for you guys today. Hopefully, well, some of you probably are driving home from work when you're listening to this, but others may have gotten the holiday off. But the problem is, what do you now call the holiday? Of course, we should call it Columbus Day to celebrate the great man who founded America. Well, not found, but discovered America and led to the European settlement of the continent. Or you may now have to refer to it as Indigenous Peoples Day to celebrate the people who were already here and had been here for time immemorial, according to the people who propose and support Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's actually going to be the first topic today, is Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day. Now, hatred for Columbus is nothing new. It's been going on for quite a while now. I remember in school people were challenging Columbus Day, and it's only increased since then. And obviously there's even more Sopranos episodes in the early 2000s that, focus in on the controversy around Columbus Day and Indians not liking it. But now it's grown in popularity to the point where over 100 cities now celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day rather than Columbus Day. Boston just last week announced that they will no longer refer to it as Columbus Day. It is now Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's a day to think back in shame and reflect on all the terrible things we've done to the American Indians. So that's one thing going on with that. So it's also been the cities. And also many states are now issuing, I think roughly half the states of the Union now issue Columbus Day proclamations. A few have moved into the direction of making it Columbus Day, now Indigenous Peoples Day. I think Oregon and Vermont and a few others, they now no longer refer to it as Columbus Day. They just refer to it as Indigenous Peoples Day. So it is a holiday that is replacing another one. And it's in, we always talk about the Great Replacement and things like that. But this is a little replacement of how American history should be seen and remembered and honored. And Columbus Day is meant to, even though Italian Americans now celebrate it as their day, and that's the main argument going in for why we should keep it, is because Italian Americans, it really is celebrating the fact of European discovery of the continent and European settlement. And without people like Columbus, we would not be here. And that's what a part of our nation's heritage, that's a part of our nation's tradition. Without that history, we would not be a country, and it's honoring that. So, and there's also arguments over, whether it should be Leif Erikson Day or Columbus Day. One of the reasons why they wanted Leif Erikson Day back in the early 20th century is that they felt that Columbus Day was a day meant to celebrate all these immigrants who were coming over, the Ellis Islanders, even though specifically Italians. And all the WASP were like, well, we want to celebrate a more Nordic discoverer. So they settled on Leif Erikson, the great Icelandic Scandinavian Viking who came and found what would today be part of Canada. But, they see him as the person that they should honor in order to say, like, Nordics found the country, not these were the Italians, even though Christopher Columbus himself was a Northern Italian and repeatedly had red hair and blue eyes, so not necessarily your typical Sicilian, as even they make jokes about in The Sopranos. So there's always been that dynamic and tension there with the holiday. So the original purpose of the holiday, even though it fit within American tradition and the historic American identity, it was to celebrate these great Italian immigrants and became, people have made noted this, is that it is a holiday that was initially based around a kind of identity politics, and it is identity politics. It was like, we need, as Italian immigrants or as Ellis Islanders, we need our own holiday to show that we belong. And they're like, well, you can have Columbus, even though most of you are not from Genoa. Here you go, here's your hero. And then that was turned into an ethnic holiday, but even though it is an ethnic holiday, it is something that all Americans should celebrate, because we all should honor and celebrate European settlement and European discovery of the continent. And that's something that is a part of our heritage and our history. And that's something that we have to honor. So it's not, whether we're arguing over Leif Erikson or Columbus Day, and even really the Leif Erikson Day is like super contrarianism. Leif Erikson did discover the New World before Columbus, but his discovery did not lead to European settlement or mass European settlement in the way that Columbus's discovery did. And that's why Columbus is a more important figure than Leif Erikson. And that's why, and even the founders always honored him, District of Columbia. Most states have a Columbia within their within their state. I mean, our Columbus, Columbus, Ohio. So there is all these, he has been long cherished as a figure here. It wasn't just the Italian immigrants who just like, wow, we hadn't heard about Columbus before. No, they had automatically seen Columbus as an American hero before, but that's why Italians grasp onto him to show that they belong here too, because this Italian discovered this new world and you all honor him and you should honor us for coming here, which there is that point there. So it was a part of that identity politics of the early 20th century, but now it's coming up against the identity politics of the early 21st century, and it's losing dramatically. And the identity politics of the early 20th century is not doing well against the identity politics of the early 21st century. That's kind of why I get tired of any arguments that conservatives make. It's like, well, it's about Italian heritage. It's about Italians. We love the Italians. I mean, yeah, I understand that. But first off, there is the important note that Columbus was from a different area than most of the Italians who are in America. But regardless of that, the main importance of Columbus is this universal appeal that he has for all Americans and this traditional America. As I don't want to belabor this point, but that's why it should be celebrated. It's like we should be celebrating this day for the European settlement and discovery, not because of Italians need their own day. It's like they can honor him as their hero, but that's not why we called the District of Columbia, or why there's a Columbia in every state. It's because we feel that this is an important part of our heritage and our nation, and that's why we honor Columbus as one of our own. And this is a threat not just to Italian heritage or whatever that they want to say. It's a threat to our whole identity and heritage and how we see ourselves. And now this attack on Columbus, when all these people are like, he was terrible for his time, he was so bad, and there's this horrible conservative, Josh Jordan, who's a never Trumper who will get mad when Democrats are being anti-Israel or not wanting to cut taxes, but then he'll come and reaffirm the liberal line on the issues that actually matter. And he's saying there's no need to do this presentism. We must see Columbus as a bad man. He was evil even for his day. He's terrible. I would just not honor him at all. And it's what do you imagine the New World discoverers were supposed to be like? That they were modern tourists that were just coming there and it's oh, I like your exotic culture. I don't want to do a thing to you. I don't even have weapons. It's what do you imagine the world was like pre, the modern era? What do you idiots think this world is? It's a nasty place. Without people doing nasty, cruel, things that we would see as terrible, we would not have our country today. We would have not had European settlement. Columbus did literally nothing wrong in the context of what people are complaining about. It's the tribes that he came and conquered, many of them enslaved, many were engaged in warfare. There's few that were reputed to be cannibals. And it's oh no, Columbus did this thing where they killed some natives and they did this. And it's well, what do you imagine the world was like then? And it's you're also, any condemnation and criticism of Columbus is essentially saying the Europeans should have never come. That it was such a disgrace and horrible event that we came here. And it's well, were the Tainos, were they going to create America? Were they going to create this, a world superpower? No. What do you think that was going to happen? Yeah, the Cribs, we'll let them, after they're finished their meal of human flesh, we'll let them start the United States of America, and then they'll welcome everyone in. It's no, that's not how it was going to happen. Without the European, people coming here, we would not have any of the New World. There would be no development here. And well, there would be some type of civilization, but if you think the Aztecs were great, then hats off to you. But they literally did nothing wrong. Any of the savagery is overstated and exaggerated, and it overlooks what the natives were doing among themselves, and what even the natives did to the people who were existing here prior to them coming across the Bering Land Strait. And they always want to deny this. The point about indigenous people is in the meaning of that name. It implies that they were here since the beginning of time, like they sprouted from the ground. And this is completely ascientific. There is no basis for this. And it's like, there's no, people don't sprout from the ground. But that's what they want to believe, because they're like, well, our religion, our native religion teaches that we came from the ground, or we were just already here. And they're like, oh, we have to respect that because it's an exotic native culture. And it's like, no, they came across the land strait. There were people already here. A lot of them had been similar to what the Australian Aborigines, and they wiped them out. And then they wiped out each other. They enslaved each other. The Aztecs were sacrificing natives by the thousands in human sacrifice. And it's like, what? But the impression is that this is just a peaceful, loving area that was living in accordance with nature and just finding their true selves out in the jungle. And Columbus just ruined everything. He introduced war and slavery and all these terrible things that none of these natives had even were aware of. I mean, they just believed that the point of life was just living in peace. And this is the impression that's conveyed to the school child who doesn't read past, what is taught to them in school. And so this is completely idiotic. And I think the way we're now treating the the American Indians, we're not calling them indigenous. Indigenous is a term, and in fact, by the way it's conveyed and described in our society, it's fundamentally anti-white, because whites cannot be indigenous anywhere they are. I mean, people sometimes want to take that term and say, it's like, oh, we're indigenous Europeans. It's like, no, they're never going to give you that term. Indigenous is only reserved for non-whites, and wherever they live, they're indigenous, and they're getting colonized by the evil Europeans. Europeans and whites are always the villain in the narrative that includes indigenous, or is upholding the righteousness of indigenous peoples. So we can never use that. In America, we can't necessarily claim we're indigenous, but we can claim we're native, because before we were here, there was no America. We made America in the late 1700s. That's when the America started. There was no America before we came here. It was descended from the European settlers. Not the Indians played no role in it besides being the enemy, besides being the other that shaped the identity created and fostered by the European settlers. So they are not the Native Americans. We are. That's the fact of the matter, because there was no country before us. We made the country possible. And yeah, they're like, well, they were on the land. Well, they didn't make the country. There's no the country that gave people the identity, that was created by us. And there's no argument in that. But that's a shameful thing. We shouldn't honor us, and we have to hide who actually founded this country. That's why we have all these holidays dedicated to these specific racial groups that weren't very involved in the creation and founding of America. And we denigrate and demonize those who actually founded this country. And that's going to be the new way we look at our history and the new holidays we have. Any holiday that is going to celebrate whites or Europeans or the historic American nation are going to be scuttled. They're going to be jettisoned or reframed in a way that it can honor instead the great POC coalition, or imagine that we're a country that was primarily founded by non-whites and whites are the villains. And this is the point of Indigenous Peoples Day. In the very same way that Juneteenth operates. Juneteenth is not a celebration of America ending slavery. It is a day to demonize America for having slavery in the first place, and to castigate white Americans for their role in slavery and how they owe a massive debt to blacks, to Magic Americans. That's the point of Juneteenth, is to reflect on the terrible things we have done and to advocate for racial justice, to correct these wrongs, and to pay back this tremendous debt that America owes to blacks, and to celebrate just how special they are. And eventually it's going to supplant July 4th because, well, for the one reason it comes before July 4th in the summer. There's always a need for a summer holiday to give people the week off, to have the big car sales, or to have the day at the the pool or the beach weekends, those are always, that's usually set aside for July 4th. But employers, if they're going to have to choose which day do people go, they may be called racist for not giving people the day off for Juneteenth. And it's the same with city and states. If they have to have festivities, there's a limited amount of funds for public festivities. And if they have to choose whether to have a Juneteenth parade or a July 4th parade, I think they're going to go with Juneteenth. And there was already a few examples of cities, going with Juneteenth instead of July 4th. I think it was Evanston, Illinois, this really woke suburb of Chicago that's also giving away reparations. They replaced the Juneteenth parade, or they replaced the July 4th parade with Juneteenth public event. So that could happen. That could happen everywhere with Juneteenth, because Juneteenth makes more sense for the current American identity, which is fundamentally anti-white. Imagines that the point of America is being diverse and multicultural and celebrating the great POC coalition and imagining that whites are the great villains. And that's why Indigenous Peoples Day is replacing Columbus Day, is that we can no longer honor great European men who may have done terrible or cruel things in their time, but it's like, it doesn't matter. It's like everything that Columbus and the founders and discoverers and the settlers did was necessary in order to create civilization in the New World, or the type of civilization that led to the creation of America. And so there's no reason to denigrate them, but they use that to denigrate them, and then they uphold this mythical idea of the indigenous people as these just peaceful, loving, wonderful, noble people that we really should honor as our true founders, not these dead white men. And I think over time it's going to see the same. I don't think Columbus Day is going to be officially celebrated unless radical cultural changes happen in our direction by 2030. I think in most places it's going to be totally replaced by Indigenous Peoples Day. It's like, look at Juneteenth. Like, this is a holiday nobody had heard of last year, and now it's a federal holiday. These things can happen rapidly and change in a certain direction. And I think if the movement is in that direction to totally replace it, and it's just going to take a couple more years to have the full replacement of Columbus Day. And the arguments that they use is like, well, we need a day to celebrate Italians. That is a weak argument. The better argument is to focus on is we need a day to celebrate the European discovery and settlement of this country. And without that event, we would not be here. We would not have this country. We would not be who we are. And that is the reason to celebrate it, not just to limit it to we need a day to honor Italians. No, there's a bigger picture there. There's a more moral case for why we should celebrate Columbus Day. So even if you have no Italian heritage, you should see Columbus as one of the great American heroes. And yes, we all know he didn't discover the continent. Yeah, whatever. But his discovery led to the settlement of Europeans in the New World. And that's why we honor him. And that's why we should defend him. And of course, they're going to tear down his statues and everything. But these things, the one upside to this is it does create a separation between the true American nation and the phony globalist American empire's identity. It's good that the empire is ashamed and doesn't want to use Columbus to identify itself or see itself in Columbus. Is that Columbus is now one of these figures that we can say is a part of the true American nation, and it's one of our true heroes that we honor and celebrate. And we no longer have to worry about the globalist American empire tainting him and them using his likeness and his achievements to argue for the terrible things that they believe in and want to advocate for. And it's the same way with Robert E. Lee and all these other canceled figures from our past, that we can still honor them, that they are not going to erase their heritage from our country. We are still going to have Columbus and Columbias throughout the country, and we're still going to see Columbus as one of our own. Now, the one thing that's going to be interesting is if District of Columbia and Columbia University decide to change their names to accommodate the new zeitgeist, the mindset that Columbus is this evil man who shouldn't be honored. There could be a potential for that. I think the one thing that reason why that won't happen is that those are brands. Well, especially with Columbia University, there's like a certain brand with that that people go there to say they went to Columbia. They're not going there to, if they change the name, that does undermine the brand for that university. And these prestigious universities live off their brand. If that brand is taken away, then that hurts their reputation and it undermines the reason why people go there. So I think Columbia will probably keep its name, but they'll do like a land acknowledgement or something. They might already do a land acknowledgement. That's another weird thing that we see, this like worship of indigenous is like now we have to give like a land acknowledgement. And it's like all these different places. Like I had a friend who went to some historic site associated with Patrick Henry. And at this site, they read a land acknowledgement there, and it's like it's just everywhere that they have to do a land acknowledgement, and it's like no, it's not their land, it's our land. They lost. That's how human history works. They were not, and I want to really emphasize, these were not just these peaceful people living out in the woods and never knowing warfare, is that they were very savage. They did horrible things, and that they did not want us here, and they tried to wipe us out when we settled here, but they lost. And that's now our land. It's not their land. There's no reason to acknowledge that. They should acknowledge that it's our land and stop whining about it. Chief Sitting Feather, coming up and going, this is our land. It's like, no, it's not. It's ours. Like, you have your reservation. That's where you're at. I mean, you now have all the freedoms and privileges of living in modern America. It's time to stop living off resentment towards us. Now with District of Columbia, I also think that it's just going to be too much of a hassle to change the name. I don't see that happening this decade. Maybe next decade. I mean, I could be surprised. I think there will be some people who will demand like a different name, but they don't really want to change actual state and city names. They do, they stick to like street names, and they'll stick to mountain. They'll like the furthest they'll go is like mountains and landmarks. But when it comes to cities and states and localities, they haven't gone that far yet. So I could see a movie developing to change the name of District of Columbia, but I don't see it happening this decade, but it could happen. I mean, they want to get rid of this whole legacy of European settlement, even though we're here. We're supposed to feel bad for stealing this land, but people aren't moving away from the land, so it's totally inauthentic, and it's just a way of signaling against their heritage and against like Trump supporters and against Red America, and just feeling morally superior by like saying, oh, we're living on stolen land. I bet you haven't heard this radical idea before. It's like, we have, believe it or not. And this does have real world consequences. The Supreme Court ruled last year that nearly half of Oklahoma is now tribal territory. And it's created complete chaos in that state where like people, like criminals, are getting released left and right because they were convicted under Oklahoma rule court and Oklahoma state, which they should have been tried on reservation territory. And now there's like this debate over funding and stuff, and it's like over how crime is enforced, and it's created a whole chaos. And this is all due to Neil Gorsuch is like, well, we made a treaty, and treaties just don't dissipate over time. And then so they give like half the state to Indian tribes, and it's like ridiculous. We could see more of that happening. And like just this moral commitment to POC resentments and grievances, and doing our best to fulfill them, but they'll never be fulfilled, and they'll keep complaining up until we're gone. And that's the main point I want to emphasize. And we still have to cling to Columbus Day. Columbus Day is our holiday. And we should never, ever believe or see it as Indigenous Peoples Day. And, really what we need is a true Native Americans Day. But that's really July 4th. It's a celebrating the people who created this country. And it's not it's so-called Indigenous people. So that's the last thing I want to say about this holiday. So happy Columbus Day. And we're going to keep fighting for it till the end. Moving along, now I want to go on the subject of black privilege. We got a good example of this last week when young Timothy Simpkins, I assume he's a future NASA scientist, he got into a little scuffle at his school, and he ended up shooting 3 people
And for, this is a school shooter. This is another one of these things we always like to, when school shootings happen, this is the worst thing we've ever witnessed. Like, these people are the worst of our society. We shouldn't even name them or show their faces anywhere because we don't want to give them any of that notoriety that they crave. Well, with Timothy Simpkins, that all through it was thrown out the window. He got bail just the day after, only $75,000, which, nearly killing 2 people and wounding another. It's little odd for him to get such a low bail and to be released just a day after. And after he was released, the media sympathetically portraying his story, saying like, "Oh, he was bullied. He was such a bullied kid. This isn't like other stereotypical school shootings. Like, he was bullied." And it's like, that's every school shooting. Pretty much, as every kid claims they were, bullied before they went on a school shooting rampage. I mean, even Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter, claimed he was bullied. I think even the kids, the ones who went on their gun control mission afterwards, they even defended bullying him. And nobody really cared. I mean, it's like, whatever. He was clearly a weird kid, very odd person who should have probably not been in that school. And in the first place, but they still, no one gave him a sympathetic hearing for rightfully so. But now they give it to Mr. Simpkins, even though he is, still school shooter, and he nearly killed a teacher who, jumped in the fight, shot him in the back, and that teacher's got serious health problems now due to the wounds he suffered. And why is this guy getting this treatment? Well, there's something a little different from him than other school shooters. He's black. And, they're like, oh, well, now this is totally different. And when this first happened, there was all these people going on. It's like, oh, another school shooter. When will whites stop terrorizing their schools and everything? And they're like, oh, it's POC. Oh, never mind. There's a reason here. And there's all these awfuls who are on Twitter saying he was bullied. We deserve to hear his story. He had to protect himself and he had to use a gun. And it's all getting warped. And now his family even has a GoFundMe to help him through the trauma of shooting people. And his family got a civil rights attorney. They didn't get a normal defense attorney. They got a black civil rights attorney who's represented people claiming they face racism in the workplace. That's who they have representing them. And this woman's already going out and saying this is not a normal school shooting. You guys attacking the media for running with their narrative of, how could they run with this narrative of a kid shooting up his school? They need to learn the facts first. And also the family's defending his actions and saying he had to protect himself. Or he could have just committed suicide, but instead he shot people. So let's put this in perspective. And it's this is very strange. But this whole story, the way it's playing out from the family's perspective, even them having a fun picture with the school shooter after he's released out of jail, the GoFundMe, getting a civil rights attorney to represent them, getting a sympathetic hearing in the media, and the authorities going easy on him. You have to say this is black privilege. We've always heard about in this country, we have white privilege where you get certain advantages and benefits that non-whites don't have. And there's just things that, being white is life on easy mode, apparently. But as we're growing to see, especially after the George Floyd revolution and the riots, there's a lot of black privilege in America. And they get off, they have a lot of advantages that we don't have. And a lot of things that, go in their direction that whites could never even possibly dream of obtaining, and especially with this lenient treatment for authorities. I mean, the thing they've always claimed about white privilege is that whites have it easier in the courts. But I think after the revolution that we've seen in George Floyd, and with progressive prosecutors taking control of these cities, I think the opposite is now happening, is that they will go easier on blacks because there's now this idea that's implanted in the minds of Americans that there's so much systemic racism and we're so hard on blacks that we need to give them easier treatment to compensate for all the wrongs we've done to them in the past. This is what I wrote about in my latest Revolver piece that getting a lot of positive attention. I don't know. People just can't believe how high IQ and erudite it is. But I want to say this about
the criminal justice system is actually starting to impact with this black privilege thing. And this is starting to negate the whole thing that they talk about white privilege, is just how certain circumstances blacks can now expect a much easier time in the criminal justice system compared to whites, and depending on where they are. There is now where, with this young Mr. Simpkins, he can now, depending if he had done this in a different place, he could have been let off with no charges, because Chicago now operates on a mutual combat principle, where they just had last week, or a couple, recently, where there was this vicious gang battle where people died and several got wounded. It was like in broad daylight. It was a very long lasting gang shootout. And they dropped charges under the concept that they were engaged in mutual combat. And there was also a guy who, got stabbed to death, and the guy who stabbed him was dropped charges because they were engaged in mutual combat. And there's a few other cities where you're starting to see this as well, where people engaged in gang shootouts and other types of conflicts like that are being let off what appears to be the mutual combat principle, that they're just engaged in this, and if shooting happens. And you could say that Simpkins was involved in a mutual combat situation. He was in a fight. He was in a brawl. It's unclear. There's a video of a brawl coming from the classroom, and they say that Simpkins is involved. It's unclear if he's the guy whooping the other person's ass or the one getting whooped. So this is all cases that we're seeing where it could be, what his arguments could say, well, I was engaged in mutual combat. I think you should let me off. We'll have to see what authorities involve themselves in, or engage in themselves in, how they prosecute Simpkins. There's also the thing that blacks can get away with self-defense arguments when they shoot at police. There was a guy in Minnesota who shot at police during the riots. He claimed that, he thought he was getting targeted by a gang because they're in a unmarked van, but if you look at the van, it's clearly like a police vehicle. And then the police officers, who, after they had just gotten shot at, they went and beat him up. And he used this argument that he got beaten up by the police when they arrested him after he had shot at them, that, this is self-defense and they brutalized me. And, of course, he was acquitted. And they found his self-defense argument credible. There's even arguments that if you just startle a black, they're a right to shoot you. As I mentioned in this horrible case in South Carolina over the summer, there was a 77-year-old white man who retired, a volunteer fire chief and a deacon at his church, was sitting alone in his truck at 9 a.m. on a summer morning. This is not a time where it's dark or you could see things going on. And some black guy approached him, and apparently the white guy in the truck, a 77-year-old man, startled the black guy, and he shot him up, and he was able to be acquitted on the fact that, you can't startle blacks. And there's no indication that the white guy did anything wrong. It's just that he may have made a movement that startled the black person, and he had to shoot him to death. So there are all these things that give Mr. Simpkins, some precedent in court to expect lenient treatment. And I mean, the clearest example or counterexample to use against him is Kyle Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse got a $2 million bail. He's still getting hounded by the prosecutors, who will look at his social media history. They'll look at the fact that, he's hanging out with supporters, and one of them may have been a Proud Boy, and he's doing this, that, or the other thing, or we think that he missed this date and we have to put him back in jail. They've been trying their hardest to get that bail revoked and put him back in prison. And Rittenhouse actually has a self-defense thing. As we've all seen the videos, those guys were coming at him. They were charging at him, and at least a couple of them were armed. A couple of them, there's even reports that some of them had been shooting, people had been shooting at him and had been chasing him and been hitting him with skateboards. And one of the guys he had was just about to raise a gun up to shoot him. There is a much better self-defense case for Rittenhouse, and it's all on video. All this stuff is on video. But the fact that he looks like a kid. He looks like he's, he committed this when he's 17, and he still looks like a child in this. I mean,
There's a much, Simpkins does, I mean, he looks young, but he doesn't look like, I mean, he's 18 years old, but they're trying to portray him as like a little 12-year-old. There's a clear difference there, and they've been trying their hardest to throw the book at Rittenhouse, and they've given him murder charges, and there's a much clear example of self-defense there. But even outside of the Rittenhouse, you just have to look at all the people who are still locked up from January 6th. Over 70 people are still locked up from January 6th. And most of these people, they just have the crime of walking around without permission. There's a few of them who attacked officers, but even then you have to say, it's like, well, if they got in a scuffle with officers, that is like a serious offense, but you just have to say, it's like, why are they still locked up for months? And they keep delaying their trial so they can stay locked up for over a year with no bail. And then you have to wonder, it's like, well, how did this kid get bail? And it looks like he may still pose a danger to a school. And none of this is taken into consideration. And you can't raise a GoFundMe for these guys, but you can for Mr. Simpkins to help him through his trauma. And so, our courts take the offense of walking through the Capitol without permission more seriously than they do black school shooters. That's a fact of the matter. That's the truth. And that's the society we operate under, and under black privilege. And this doesn't just extend to the criminal justice system. This extends out everywhere. I mean, the clearest examples of black privilege is just how we will now see racism towards them as the worse offense than murder. There was a black guy who worked at Tesla who was awarded over $100 million in a settlement from the company for claiming he heard like the N-word at work. And he's still like saying he's traumatized. And it's like over $100 million. Like most people who like suffer like life-threatening injuries or things that like permanently paralyze them get less money in workplace compensation suits. But with this is like a guy getting it just for allegedly hearing the N-word at work. And that is a part of black privilege, is that if you offend or assault them, that is a greater offense than, getting injured and being permanently paralyzed. That's something that you just can't overcome, is like hearing racism. And people continually use accusations of racism or allegations of racism to fortify their respective cases, or to say that they deserve a refund or they deserve better service, or the fact that if you inconvenience or annoy or offend blacks, they can take a video of you and ruin your life, because there's no greater offense than annoying blacks or inconveniencing them. All those Karen videos of like just somebody going up and like saying, hey, can you do this? And then them pulling out their phone, and then their whole world crashing down, as we saw with the Birdwatcher video last year from New York, where this woman, they got into some dispute. I mean, it's like a dumb argument people get into all the time about a dog on a leash, and she threatened to call the cops, and he had likely been threatening the dog. But in this case, like, this woman was turned into the worst villain, worse monster than the school shooter, Simpkins in Texas. And she was, lost her job, was arrested and charged with serious offenses. And the only way she was able to avoid these offenses was by going through like anti-racist training. and then, her whole life is ruined. Her name's out there. It's forever ruined. And it's all just because she got in an argument with a black guy. And so it's, and this kid, depending on his, what happens with him in the trial, he could have less life-altering effects from shooting people at a school than somebody who got in an argument with a black guy in Central Park over an unleashed dog. That's black privilege. And I think this is a real thing. It's actually not me being necessarily cutesy or something, or like, oh, look at this. It's like, it's an idea thing, but I'm not being serious about it. No, I'm dead serious about this idea of black privilege. It goes back to that point I had in a previous podcast. This is going over the Twitter user, Hool, or as you should follow him at Akboga, Aqboga. And he had this whole great thread about the black ethno-state, how we live in a black ethno-state. And this is our framework. Like, we exist as a state to serve the interests of blacks explicitly. That is who at the top of the moral hierarchy. That's who have all the privilege. That's what they argue that we have is like with white privilege. Like we're at the top of the hierarchy. We're just able to get away with things, and we're able to live in a society that meets our needs. No, 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 no. That's the opposite. We're the villains of this society. We may have a degree of economic prosperity. We probably have more, and we certainly have more wealth than blacks, but we have far less moral authority, and we're far less denigrated. And we're now learning that we can't get away with things that blacks can easily get away with. I mean, it's just like the vaccine mandate, like them able to attack over vaccine mandates and other things. But yeah, going to that point, it's like we live in a black ethno state, and one of those effects is having black privilege. And we're seeing that with school shooters. We're also seeing that with this fight over, the vaccine mandates in New York, where, these black tourists like viciously assaulted an Asian hostess for simply, saying like, I don't believe your vaccine cards are legitimate. We could argue whether, she should have just like looked the other way. She probably should have looked the other way, whether they were black or white or not. But the fact that like they attacked her and then they make up that she said the N-word and racial slur and all this stuff, and they go straight to saying that they experienced racism, and the only recourse they had was to attack somebody. And this is used time and time again in their defenses. And the criminal justice system will react to this. I've talked about a case from Florida. I think this was from 2017 or 2016, where a black guy beat to death his math tutor because they got an argument over payment, and he alleged that the math tutor called him a racial slur, and he beat him to death in like a fast food parking lot. And the state of Florida threw out the charges. They dismissed the charges. This they can get away with this as long as they can prove racism. And as a society, we do view them as morally superior to everyone else. Their culture sets the tone. I mean, rap music has replaced rock. We always view black artistry as greater than white art and white entertainment. And they do. And now we even shape school policy to ensure that more blacks get into schools. And the fewer blacks there are, the worse it is and the worse education it has. So, the thing about black ethno state is like, yes, blacks themselves may not be fully in charge in these leadership positions. Yes, they may not be economically prosperous, but as a society, we view them as the superior beings, and as a society, we view them as the protagonists of America now. That's the point of 1619 Project. That's the point of Ibram X. Kendi. That's the point of critical race theory. And it's to shape America away from the true founders of this country, the European settlers, into black Americans. And this is, that's why you got to call them Magic America. I mean, it's like, it's of course being facetious, but we do attribute like magical qualities to them, that they're able to do things that we're not, and they're just so much better than us. And this is the consensus idea towards them, and that's why they're awarded privilege. And we see this now in the case of school shooters, is that they can. He hasn't fully gotten away with school shooting, but I can guarantee you that he's going to get easier treatment and a more lenient charge than a white guy who was put in this position. And a white person would have not been let out of jail in just a day, and his family would have not been allowed to have a GoFundMe, and his family would not have a civil rights attorney to say about how this kid was bullied. None of that would have occurred. I mean, well, maybe if it was like gay or trans, but even with gay or trans, there was like a trans school shooter a few years ago, and that person just got a long time in jail. And so, of course, that person, difference is that person, I think, killed some people. But, this is the world we live in. That we do live in a black ethno state, and that comes with black privilege. And so it's a fact of life, and people need to, this is what we need to push back on. When they talk about white privilege, point out black privilege. It's way more real. There's more real examples, and it fits in with what are the direction of our country. Even though I just criticized black privilege, I do want to compliment black privilege on this one thing, which is eliminating gifted programs and these stringent admission standards that is actually helping Asians the most, which this became a news topic because last week New York City announced that they were going to eliminate gifted programs, and they're saying, of course, there's not enough racial diversity because there's not enough blacks and Hispanics in it. It's pretty much mostly Asians and whites, but probably due to New York City. And if you've seen the pictures from some of these schools, it's it appears it's almost plurality Asian rather than helping whites out. And you're seeing a lot of conservatives complain about this, like, oh, this is a war on the gifted and war on meritocracy and everything. And I agree with that. But at the same time, the people whose kids are most benefiting from this are the ones ruining our country. And I think it's time that they pay a price for that. And if they want to say how great diversity is and how awful, evil white America is and how it's so great we're overcoming our past and we're replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, it's time for them to live with the consequences. It's time for them to see and experience the country they've created. And they can't hide through it with these admissions tests. They have to experience it full bore. You need more racial diversity. You need to experience magic America. You need some magic in your life. And I'm glad that New York City is now going to deliver magic to these Asians who think that they can live above it, and then their kids can become anti-white and support the whole liberal agenda and stand with Black Lives Matter. Well, it's time to get some Black lives into your school. It's time to learn that they matter too, just as much as you do. And your smart tests and IQ can't save you. And I want to say, like, the one thing that conservatives always complain about with, like, affirmative action and these elimination of meritocratic standards is how much it hurts Asians. And it's like, why do we care about that? That's like the only benefit of it. I mean, not saying like we should, be discriminating against Asians or something like that. But without those standards, it's like Asians become to dominate these schools. Like pretty much all the best public universities in California are plurality Asian. And those are the leaders of the state. Those are who get to make the state what it is. And if you're enjoying California, well, imagine that with just the whole country. And they always complain, it's like Harvard and Yale don't have enough Asians. It's like, yeah, but those places are still like plurality white. They're like the only places that are plurality white. They're elite schools. If you didn't have like this type of system in place, like it would be like plurality or majority Asian. And that's not necessarily good we want a whole like elite caste becoming Asian. I think that there are significant problems with that. I think that they have no real ties to historic America. I think they're a lot of ways most supportive of these left-wing agenda items. If you see a lot of these activists who are involved, many of them are Indians. That's of course in the Asian category. That's many of the people, who are demanding these changes. So if you're thinking that it's like going to be better, I don't think like a meritocracy, like our country's crumbling. Like it's time for those people who are exploiting or benefiting from the meritocratic system, who are at the same time trying to destroy the historic America, experience those effects of the country that they've created. So it's like good that these Asians now are not going to get these elite schools, or they're going to be limited in how many of them can get into Harvard. It's like we don't want to repeat myself, we do not want an elite caste that's entirely Asian, which is what it would largely be if we just eliminated these caps and quotas and just went to the system that enlightened centrists want. That's not, and many conservatives complain about it. It's like they're all like, we don't like Harvard system because it discriminates against Asians, or they've now added Jews for some reason to that to further like their commitment to identity politics. They can't just say whites because that doesn't help. They feel like, oh well, we don't want to sound racist or something. It will just focus on Asians and maybe Jews, and that's it. And of course, whites are severely disadvantaged in affirmative action, especially when it comes to hiring. But when it comes to these education, it is in a large part it is Asians, and I don't think that they're like their parents are voting for this, and they shouldn't be immune from the consequences of that. So that's why I support it. I think De Blasio's. I think it's great. I think these parents who think that they can vote for leftism but not have it impact their daily lives need to learn a lesson that it's going to impact their lives, and they need to experience greater sense of racial diversity. So I'm all here for it. And some listeners may say, well, it's going to impact a lot of whites, but I mean, that is true. It's going to impact some whites, but usually those are also the children of white liberals too. I mean, that's like the people in New York City. It's not like there's like these are normal conservative parents. I mean, there are some, but they're, in a minority of there, and its majority of them are like white liberal parents who also believe in public schools, and like, we've got to send our kid to enjoy diversity. Well, it's time for them to enjoy diversity. And even with these defenders, they get so furious at the fact that any of these, elimination, these standardized testing or emissions testing would lead to, an increase of whites. When there was a Northern Virginia school, which was very competitive to get into, and a lot of Asians were wanting in there, and it usually had a large Asian population, they eliminated these emissions testing and just went into, a different curriculum or different criteria for acceptance in order to increase racial diversity. It found out that it increased the white student population, and all these Asians were furious and calling about like the white supremacy of these liberals and stuff, and how awful the fact that it increased white student population. So, and they're like, and this is like conservatives saying this, and you're like, well, maybe that's a good thing. Like, maybe we should have more whites in these schools. And but I don't. It's not like I don't think that those people are necessarily going to be on our side. But it's like we really, these are like one of the things I'm starting to learn is like, outside of hiring practices, like affirmative action is probably, due to its effect on Asians, is the one thing that is like keeping whites still in the elite class. Like, I think if we did eliminate affirmative action first off, they would never eliminate to the extent where it would disadvantage blacks, and there would be so few blacks. So that would never, under this current standards, it wouldn't happen. They would still find ways to have 10 to 15% of blacks of a school student population be black. There's no way that they would ever try to eliminate it to where it goes down to 5% or lower. And I think that would be the compromise, is that, well, okay, we'll eliminate affirmative action, but we will like agree to some quota system. So you'd still get like blacks who probably were not, as a part of black privilege, they don't have to succeed as much or have as good as grades or good as testing to get into these schools. They would still be accepted in, but at the same time, you would further eliminate the white student population from these elite schools, and it'd become plurality Asian, as what we see in California. And that's one thing why we have to like really put at the forefront of not just critical race theory as anti-white, as affirmative action as anti-white. Because if you don't acknowledge this fact, you then get misdirected into the place of where you're complaining that, a school is not 40% Asian, it's only 20%. And then you're working towards that goal of it, or you're saying stupid things like critical race theory is anti-Asian when it's not. They're not white. They're still put in the POC category. And then they say that they're victims because they're called the model minority. And we have to do more to overcome this horrible tragedy and terrible thing that they're complimented. So even that part isn't even true. And so really, for both facts, like, you'd really have to say that affirmative action is anti-white, and acknowledging that and working towards that makes it a better opposition towards the fact that you're worried about how many Asians there are and there are not enough Asians in these elite schools, and we have to keep these meritocratic standards that are eliminated in most aspects of life, but they have to be kept for schools. So these elites who have Black Lives Matter signs outside on the front lawn and march for BLM and are voted for Biden and believe that Trump supporters should lose all their rights and the unvaccinated should be totally purged from society. And when they're voting and supporting the type of terrible society that is wreaking havoc on middle America, and when they start to experience, and they feel like they shouldn't experience any of the effects of it, that their kids are able to go to a nice little school, free of diversity, or free of the wrong kind of diversity, and be comforted in the fact that they have a few token minorities who are going to be well behaved. No, they shouldn't escape those effects. They should experience a full burst of a diversity, and that's what they voted for, and that's what they deserve. And I will not shed any tears that their kids are now going to not be accepted into the good school and be sent to the bad school. It's what they voted for. It's what they have to. They made their bed. It's time to sleep in it. So the concluding thought: whenever you hear these arguments about how affirmative action is bad because it discriminates against Asians, it's not that we're supporting anti-Asian discrimination, but there is a
point that you don't want your entire elite to be Asian. And I think the one silver lining to affirmative action is that it does keep at this current time from like Asians completely taking over elite, which would not be a good thing at all. Now, time for the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.substack.com. This question comes from our same person who asked the question last week. This comes from Manfred, and this was such a good question that he's like, you don't have to answer this the next week, but I insisted. It was such a good question that this is when people ask music questions, this is the type of stuff you should ask. And so I want to praise Manfred for asking this question. He asks, what is, in your opinion, the most underappreciated second wave black metal album? And I know a lot of the listeners out there are already groaning at the idea of this. Is like, I hate black metal. Why does Scott listen to this stupid noise? He needs to listen to real music. But those people are sadly mistaken, and I'm going to make them black metal fans, whether they like it or not. And when I first actually read this question, I actually misread it. I thought he meant, like, what do you think is the most underappreciated second wave black metal bands or albums, plural? And then I reread it as like, oh, album. Well, that's an easy answer. But first, before I get to that, you have to ask, well, what the hell is second wave black metal? What is the difference? And there's not a clear definition of it, but really the best definition is second wave black metal is black metal of the 90s. First wave is black metal of the 80s. And then after like 99, it's just black metal. Like, there's no more waves. Like, the type of, musical development that had occurred in the 90s had already been settled. There's a few new changes and progressions in the genre, but generally most of it had already been settled by the time of the late 90s, and there's just a few more developments that have been going on since then. So there's no more waves, so to speak, but the second wave black metal is when it got very popular and the genre fully cemented itself as a sound and as an aesthetic and a feeling and what it was about. While the first wave black metal, was still like mixing it with like traditional heavy metal, and it was very primitive and it was still trying to figure itself out. While second wave black metal, it had this sound established about the look and what it meant to be black metal, is much clearer definition of what it was and clarify genre. So, even though I say it's the 90s, I guess, I would probably put this sometime in the late 90s. I think, it's the bands who immediately emerged or were there at the time when this genre first grabbed the headlines in metal magazines in like 93, 92. And followed all the big Norwegian bands, or were the Norwegian bands themselves. So I would say it's like black metal albums released from 91, 92 till 97, I would say is the best way to describe it. Even though you could just say the 90s, it's fine. But there are some albums released before that meet or sound more like the first wave. And then there are albums that are like that are just too latecomers, too late in making, that it's a little it's not necessarily accurate to call them second wave albums. So with that in mind, I'm sure some people are already tuning off by now, but you don't need to turn off. This is way more important than my political take. So when the most underappreciated second wave black metal album, if it's singular, this is an easy answer. It is Sacramentum's Far Away from the Sun. It was released in 1995. It was a Swedish band. A lot of comparisons to it and Dissection. Dissection was another big Swedish band. Had a very much more melodic sound and less primitive recording, less lo-fi recording, more traditional metal recording. It was not sounded like it was recorded in a basement. So like some of the Norwegian albums that really sought to have lo-fi production values, that had pretty decent production values. It's very fast, very melodic. I would say this is one of the best black metal albums. Dissection is a great band, but Sacramentum's Far Away from the Sun is better. That's how good it is. I want to evangelize people to really listen to this album. It is
very, very good. And it's also not, I don't even think it's as dark or as intimidating as some of the other metal albums, even though it's very, very fast. It's like one of the fastest albums. If you see them live, they're just like the way they're just like strumming is like, it's like breakneck speed. And that does give it a certain quality. And some people, when I first like showed it to some people in high school, people were like, "Oh, it's like Dragon Force," but no, it's not like Dragon Force. I think most experienced listeners would notice the differences. But yeah, it's very good. It's very well written, songwriting wise. The sound is incredible. It's something that, unlike Dissection, which still has this very obvious Iron Maiden influence, and especially in kind of its song structure, and there's like some traditional metal riffing. There's none of that. It sounds more like a fully developed black metal band playing. And yeah, it's just an incredible album. The way it flows, every song is great, and it's something that was very much overlooked. I don't know why it's overlooked. I think it's getting more attention now, and there's a lot of bands that take the album as one of the main influences. Obsequies in America, which is unfortunately an Antifa metal band, but they're still good. And the Vehemenites from France, both heavily influenced by Sacramentum's first album. Their later albums aren't very good. They're kind of like lackluster melodic death metal. But that album and their first EP, Finis Malorum, I think it might be their only EP, both incredible works. And generally, I don't think people buy CDs anymore, but if you're listening to it on Spotify or iTunes or YouTube, generally they would put the EP along with the album. But if you're listening on YouTube, you can just search them separately. They'll probably give it to you on the algorithm. But yeah, I cannot stress enough how good of an album Sacramentum's Far Away from the Sun is. You know, it is, the top 5 best black metal albums. One of the best metal albums ever recorded. It is a favorite of mine. And I think it really does take the genre to the next level in a development. And it really does show something of how like far away like black and death metal have moved away from traditional rock. Like it's not like verse chorus, and like the rhythms and just the way the music is played in a continuous manner. And the way the riffs is almost like symphonic in the way that the guitars work, even though there's not that much keyboard work. It's a tasteful use of keyboard. It's not overwhelming, and it just comes out at random moments. It's not like a symphonic band, but the way the guitars work, it sounds symphonic in the way that a symphony works. So I would highly recommend that. But, you know, I wanted to talk about some other albums too. And some people, I can already hear the groans like, end the show, we're tired of this. No, there's still some other underappreciated second wave black metal albums that I have to give recommendations on. As I had thought about this question so much, like, oh man, I had this whole list, and I was like, oh, it's just singular. So I had to give some honorable mentions that also go along with that. Second album I would say is Hades, The Dawn of the Dying Sun. This is from 1997. Hades is actually one of the first Norwegian bands. They had an album that came out in like 93, 94. So that would have been right around the time that all these bands were starting. And they were seen by the scene forerunners as like one of the original bands, but they just don't get much of attention. They later changed their name to Hades Almighty due to like there was some like American thrash band that had the name Hades, and they had to change it after their second album. But their second album is incredible. Dawn of the Dying Sun. It sounds like a mix between Bathory's like Viking Works and Immortal. Very good album. Like a lot of epic song structures, a lot of songs that are like exceeding like the 7-minute mark. And it's a very, very good album. It's very underlooked. I'm surprised it was, I think maybe at the fact that it came out so late compared to like most of the stuff that was coming out in the early to mid 90s. And even though this is a band that was around at that time, the fact that it came out in 97 maybe put it, off the radar that it's like, oh, well, this is like another album. But I think it's a very, very good album. If you're somebody who appreciates like Bathory's Hammerheart, or, even if you like Immortal, you should really like this album. It's very good. And I don't know what else to explain about it. It's just very good song structures, and it's also something that is also moving away from traditional rock song format. Now, for the third album I wanted to give a mention to, it's like tough. I wanted to give more than one album mention, And I was like, well, there could be some obscure stuff I wanted, but I actually wanted to give an album that is like not well liked, but I think it is an incredible album. And I looked this album up on Metal Archives. It's from one of the biggest black metal bands, and it's got several reviews with an average rating of 69%. People really don't like it. If you ever go to Metal Archives, and if ever an album has a lot of reviews, it's generally gonna have, like, unless it's a really really hated album like Saint Anger or something like that, it's generally gonna have like in the 80s or low 90s and stuff in it. But it's generally like you really can't trust like popular opinion, especially with this album. And this album, of course, is Dimmu Borgir's Stormblast, which Dimmu Borgir became popular on a very different sound from their early albums. Like their later sound is like a big bombastic keyboards. They're singing in English, or shrieking in English. It's a better way of saying this. It's a lot of kind of like Iron Maiden-ish riffs. It's not as like lo-fi production, but their early albums, it's like it's almost kind of like soft black metal, if you want to say, especially Stormblast. It's a very accessible album, and it's similar to Sacramentum. It's like not really like a negative, like dark feeling to it. There's like kind of an almost like happy tone to it, even though it's not necessarily too happy, especially with the lyric quality. But there's like a bright aspect to it. And it's also heavily influenced by video game music. There's like a song on there that's an instrumental that's a theme ripped from from like an old Nintendo game or Famicom game. I forget which system it was, but one of the old like very first generation of console games, and that's where the song came from. They actually didn't realize that their keyboardists wrote all this music for them, and it was completely ripped off from other sources, and they had to like ditch all this when they re-recorded the album in the 2000s. The re-recorded version is terrible, but the original version from 1996 is very very good. It's one of the best of the symphonic genre. Lots of great keyboard work. It is a little cheesy, and it's not going to be necessarily the album that, if you're looking for a raw aggressive sound that's with a lo-fi production, this is not it. It is not that type of album, but it is a great album nonetheless. I don't know why people hate on it so much. Maybe it's because they want a more aggressive album. Maybe they think it's like gay or whatever, that it's or wimpy, that it's like an album that is not like super aggressive. But I think it's a great album, and it's very enjoyable. And they even use a classical sample, so it is it's a highly cultured album, I would say. And it's unfortunate the Dimmu Borgir's first album they did after that was all right. I think that's Enthroned Darkness Triumphant. They also had all these like ridiculous like album titles where they just put 3 words together that meant nothing, and that it's like, this is not proper English. But that's how they would roll with it. And their early work is all in Norwegian. So Stormblast, all the song titles and lyrics are in Norwegian. So that makes it a little bit more interesting. But I would say they're also, the first album, For All Tid, is also pretty good. But Stormblast is their real masterwork. And so I would say that it's underappreciated because it's denigrated and hated, even though Dimmu Borgir is one of the most popular black metal bands. And Stormblast is like a well-known album. I think it gets a lot of hate, and so I would say that it's underappreciated. So we want to make it a highly appreciated album. So all 3 of those albums you should check out, especially Sacramentum's Far Away from the Sun, Hades, The Dawn of the Dying Sun, or Hades Almighty. I think even on YouTube or Spotify, you look it up, it'll be under Hades. And then Dimmu Borgir, Stormblast, and the A is like a Norwegian A, and so, but you just type in Stormblast and it'll bring it up. So with that is all the time we have for today. And if there's any more metal questions, surely send them my way. But make sure to sign up for Highly Respected's Cognitive Lead if you want to ask questions in the first place. But with that in mind, that's all the time we have for today. So until next time, stay respected.